Every Genestealer cult needs a Primus, a battlefield commander that sends the forces into the fires of war, with a silhouette that deceives the Imperial citizen into thinking it's an angel when it is in fact a monster. Now, the most iconic part of Space Marine armor is undoubtedly the shoulder pad, so I knew that I wanted something that perverts this iconic form. This is when I got the idea to use the Carapace from the Tyranid Hermagon, something that would be incredibly expensive on a big army, but I already had a box open and this was going to be for a singular character. I removed the fleshy portion of the Tyranid before getting out the dust maker. My idea was to drill out the plastic inside so that I would have a very hollow shoulder pad. This way I can use them on any of the Space Marine arms similar as you would with the regular shoulder pads. After a while, I ended up switching to scraping out the rest of the way, primarily because the plastic was getting a little bit thin and it was a bit close to my hands. But after a while, I had a really awesome looking shoulder pad. I was going to modify a basic intercessor body, but I had a much better idea. Now, the Primus has this Genestealer medallion that hangs off the belt. I was going to use the mark from one of these pistols, however, when I went to separate the pieces, it unfortunately disappeared into the warp. So I grabbed the rifle with the exact same mark, this time making sure that my finger prevented any unauthorized warp travel. Fortunately, this area was designed for multiple pieces, so when I attached my medallion, it appeared as if it was always there. Now, inspired by some of the firstborn Space Marines, I thought it'd be really cool to give my Primus essentially a banner that would be attached onto his power pack. I chose to make the cut right above the hand. This way, instead of going with the small surface area of the pole, I'll have the massive area that is the banner itself. With this, I'm pretty confident the connection is going to be secure enough that it'll never accidentally break. I used a very generous amount of sprue goo, and unfortunately, when I went to attach it, it ended up being a little bit crooked. Fortunately enough, I was able to reattach it and line it up perfectly. In the codex, there's this wonderful artwork depicting a Sanctus holding a very special weapon. It's a blade that is grown from a liquid that contains the psychic essence from previously slain cultists. When someone is struck with this blade, it releases a million voices that explode inside of the victim's mind, and I was pretty confident that I could recreate this devastating weapon by using this combat knife, with a hand matching the exact pose of the artwork. And after going through all my different Genestealer pieces, I managed to find a blade that was a very close match. The Genestealer arm was holding on to the handguard, so I had to cut a little bit lower. I wasn't sure if it was going to turn out a little bit awkward, however, when I attached the two pieces, it seemed flawless. And I was incredibly excited to finally attach the cool shoulder pad. Now, originally I was going to point the scales downwards. However, I did check several references that depict scale armor, and it seems like whenever you're taller or in horseback, you position the scales in an upwards position. As most of the strikes will be coming from below, that's where you want the most protection. It also improved the overall silhouette and gave the model a much more aggressive feel to it. Due to the way the shoulder was interacting with the jousting shield, I didn't have a lot of options as to how to position the arm. When selecting the head, I had a very specific one in mind. I wanted to have a visible brain similar to what you would see on a patriarch. This is to showcase that he's technically taking control and manipulating some of the other Genestealers. Now, I left the power pack off for quite a while as I wasn't quite certain if I wanted the cape. But ultimately, I decided that he already had a lot going on and it would just get in the way visually. Similar to how there's positive bacteria, there's gonna be a positive parasite on his armor. It's sort of like a crustacean that doesn't damage him, but instead gives him an additional power. It provides him with a much more powerful amplification to his already interesting psychic ability that allows him to not just issue commands across the battlefield, but now take control over primitive Tyranids, or Tyranids that were specifically vat-grown for this purpose. To represent this parasite, I'll be using a Neuraloid, which already looks a lot like a Barnacle. I remove the tentacles and essentially send it down the area to create the idea that they're already inside of the armor connected to it, similar to how a real Barnacle has its feeding legs inserted inside of the victim. Once it was fully attached, I did flood the area with excessive amounts of sprue goo just to make the connection even more seamless. I'm sure you've noticed that Genestealer cultists are often followed by these very small creatures that you can see in a lot of the characters. And that'd be cool to do the exact same thing, but make one a little bit more special and more militarized, matching of a Space Marine. But I never really knew the lore behind them, and what I found out sort of blew my mind. They aren't grown in the exact same way you would most other Genestealers. They're sort of spawned into existence by the psychic shadow cast by the Genestealer cultists. So that makes them technically sort of like Genestealer demons. And I don't know, that's kind of insane. Genestealer cultists can spawn creatures from their psychic energy. As I wanted my Genestealer Deamon to reflect the soul of the Space Marine, I decided to not use the familiar body, but instead go with the body of a Hobgoblin. Then I took the arms from the Tyranid Termagant and essentially filed away the portion of the shoulder so that it closely matched the Hobgoblin. The connection was not perfect, but it was close enough that I was able to flood the area with just a lot of Tamiya thin cement and eventually melt the area together. Now, originally I was gonna go with a Genestealer head, but none of them really look right on the body, so I ended up going with this Krieg helmet that I thought matched it even better. And to enhance the silhouette and also just make him feel a little bit more sci-fi, I gave him this backpack from the Skitarii set. It really helped to mimic the idea how my Genestealer Space Marines are technically in stolen armor, and now so is his familiar. When I got to painting my Space Marine, I wanted to do something that's a little bit ironic. Back in the day, ships used to be painted with this very specialized copper paint that gave them this very interesting red appearance. The intended purpose of it was to prevent creatures like barnacles from attaching onto the ships and damaging the hull. Now, in my case, it does have a secondary purpose in that it mimics the Blood Angels. Ever since I painted my Assault Intercessors in a gold color, I thought it'd be interesting to hint at the idea that perhaps to use a similar color scheme. What I haven't decided on is whether it's because they do actually come from the Blood Angels, or they simply mimic it to perhaps fool some unknown Imperial citizens into thinking that the Blood Angels have come to their aid. Now, similar to how Blood Angels are highlighted with a orangish color, I decided to go with this very rusty orange look. And a big benefit when working with red or yellow pigments is that they're quite weak. As a result, I'm usually just able to mix one powerful highlight, and then because of its relatively transparent nature, I just simply glaze it over. Now, usually at this step, I would use my favorite acrylic wash, but I had to avoid it as it has a bit of a blue tint to it. It would have resulted in the miniature having these very unpleasant green tones, so I ended up doing some manual panel lining just to give the armor a bit more definition. When I got to the shoulder pads, I was gonna paint them in this rubber black that I did with all of my other Tyranids, but this time I was gonna do it in a different way. As I'd previously discovered that rubber black is essentially ochre with a little bit of black, I ended up using a lot of that to try to create a much brighter but also saturated color instead of just going in with a little bit of white and making it feel very desaturated. For the rope around his chest as well as the banner, I ended up going with this incredibly saturated pigment of purple. It's a paint called Liquitex Acrylic Gouache, and it has this absolutely intense purple hue to it, to the point that it did begin to absolutely overpower the rest of the miniature, but I love the Tyranid feel of it. What I did find a little bit interesting is that when I began to highlight it, simply adding a tiny bit of white to it, it somehow slowly became warmer, which didn't really make too much sense as white famously usually makes the colors much colder. I suspect it has something to do with the pigment they used that did not interact with the white in the exact same way that all of my other purple paints do. But I must say, the result ended up turning out even better. For the head, I started with a base of just basic magma and glow, but I've recently been testing out a different color scheme for skin where essentially instead of going with a very pinkish hue by adding whites and reds, I would instead go with ochre, which ended up creating this very nice peachy color. For the brain, I really wanted to borrow the idea from my perfect Tyranid color scheme and essentially go with this incredibly bright and saturated neon pink. The paint is technically Vallejo Warlord purple, but it is most definitely a magenta color. Now, when I got to the blade, I didn't realize that I was gonna have to airbrush it to create the smooth transition to match the rest of the Tyranids. I considered using white tag, but then I thought, what if I just use a paper towel? I was a little bit nervous that it might not be absorbent enough and some of the paint will get on the other side, but it actually ended up working out perfectly. Once I had established all of those really cool transitions, I of course came back in with a little bit of manual brushing. As with everything else that's airbrushed, it just doesn't look good until you add those manual touches that introduce that human touch of imperfection. My original idea was to paint them in a toxic green color, but as I found out that these blades are technically psychic poison, I ended up going with the exact same pinkish hue that I used for the brain, but introducing some of those tiny little highlights to make it appear as if it's almost a gem. Then for the final touch of the model, I used a few metallics. Copper for all of the Genestealer elements, and steel for elements like gun barrel, parts of the blade, as well as the power pack. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, and let's see the final result.